I'm getting these degrees because my grandfathers only had elementary educations. They were pulled out of school in elementary. My grandmothers only either dropped out at 10th grade or they just finished high school, right? Like they did not have the opportunity to do this. They did not have the opportunity to go get a degree. They did not have the opportunity to go and get all these different things. But I have them. And so therefore, because I have them, I'm so conscious of how I live out my life that it's not about me advancing in my own life. It's about me advancing the cause for them because they couldn't do it. They never got the opportunity to do it. They never got the chance to do it. So therefore, it is incumbent upon me to honor them in my education by getting what I get, because I'm not doing it for me, I'm doing it for them. Hi, everybody. Lee Scott here. Thank you for watching and or listening to this week's episode of Leading with Lee, where we help you unleash your capacity and level of leadership. I'm so excited that you are here today because this is episode 3 of this season, which is season 4. And we're going to talk about a subject today that I've been thinking about a while, actually. And I've been discussing this topic pretty much for a few months now in my consideration. And today's topic here in episode 3 of season 4 is understanding culture and context. And you may be asking yourself, Lee, why are you talking about this particular subject? And obviously this theme for this year is about leading from where you are. And I think it's super important that an aspect of leadership is understanding who you're leading and how you're leading them. And so today we're going to talk about that on this week's episode. So let's jump right in, and I'm going to give you my definition of leadership. I believe that leadership is seeing something that has not happened yet and taking people, organizations, and personal processes in that direction. I believe that leadership is seeing something that has not happened yet and taking people, organizations, and personal processes in that direction. For a while now, a few months back, I actually had revisited a podcast that I've been listening to. It was a podcast done in 2016, and it was done over the course of pretty much the whole year. It was this podcast called Presidential, where this woman she was talking to historians and individuals who had pretty much found out all this information, or biographers who were discovering information about our former presidents. Obviously, it's with the name of the podcast. And there was a particular episode I was listening to early on in the podcast series that I rediscovered and went back to. And it was actually an episode about Thomas Jefferson, who's our 3rd president of the United States. And it was talking about the unique nature of how Jefferson was the writer of the Declaration of Independence. He was our founding fathers. He had this uniqueness in having been a French diplomat. He had done all these things to shape America in a unique way. And also in writing the Declaration of Independence and having a hand in writing the U.S. Constitution, he talks a lot about liberty, freedom, and sovereignty. And the interesting juxtaposition that was happening at this particular time was that while they were talking about freedom and liberty and all these different things and sovereignty, they were also enslaving a group of individuals who I am a descendant of in our country. And this juxtaposition creates an interesting tension as we talk about this idea of culture and context. And it had always been in the backdrop of American history and had been in the backdrop of America's story. And we're still dealing with the repercussions today. And obviously, as you well know, I am an African American who is a descendant of folks who were sharecroppers and possibly slaves, and folks who have contributed to America in a unique, particular way. And we're dealing with the reverberation of those realities. And obviously, it's Black History Month as I'm talking about this issue. But we can see how understanding people in their time, and so understanding people in the context of where they were and what was normal and what was usual gives us the ability to really rationalize or assess whether or not this was the standard by which people should be living by, or the standard by which people should conduct their work. And one thing I think it's important for you as a leader, whether you're leading your family or your business or whatever, you have to understand that you are living in a context and you are influenced by a culture. So let's do some defining real quick today, because I think that this is going to be important to shaping this conversation about context and culture. Uh, Culture is defined as the customs, arts, social institutions, and the achievements of a particular nation, people, or other social group. Obviously, we know, as me being an American, there's are things that are simply American, that are associated with our country. Me being an African American, there's a thing that is associated with African Americans in our country, in our culture. Me coming from the city that I come from, or the communities that I come from, we have a social thing, social groups, meaning fraternities and sororities, civic organizations, colleges that you might have gone to. All these things are a part of social groups, whether it's Links Club or Rotary Club. All these different things have a way of shaping an individual's culture. Context, and I actually looked up the idea of what is a social context, and it is the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. Meaning, in other words, it is the bearing, or excuse me, it is the context by which we receive information, or excuse me, it says in the definition, the circumstances by which something is happening, right? So let's talk about these four things today. I got 4 points that I want to unpack today and deal with, and I'm going to give all of them to you right now really quickly. So my first point today is we all come from a culture and are influenced by a context. Number two, these realities influence our decisions and responses to situations that arise. Number three, these realities impact how we lead people. And lastly, grow in your capacity for learning. So let's deal with this first one, which is we all come from a culture and are influenced by context. I just gave you definitions of what culture and context is as it pertains to this reality. And the reality is that these influence how we see ourselves and how we see others. As I mentioned earlier, I am a Black American. I grew up in Mississippi in the 1990s and the 2000s, the 99 and the 2000s, as one comedian, one phrase from a movie that I always hear all the time. But I grew up in the 90s and the 2000s, and obviously I lived through the 2010s. I was in college at the earlier part of the 2010s, but my coming of age happened during that time. And most people who grew up in that particular time have been shaped profoundly by certain things. Obviously, I was 8 years old when 9/11 happened. I was 10 years old when the Iraq War happened. I remember when the internet blew up as a kid. I remember when some of the first cell phones came out, like the Nokia phones, and some of my friends in school we had Razor phones. And I remember the first iPhone came out, and an iPod, and all these different things have happened in my lifetime. And that has shaped me and shaped how I view, or my perspective of, the world. And the reality is that culture has influenced how I see myself and how I see myself and how do I move through this environment. And so that reality is true for me. Maybe you who are watching, you're listening, obviously you may have a completely different culture or context. You might have grew up in the 80s, or you might have grew up in the 2000s, or you might have grown up in the 70s or 60s, or you might have grown up in the East Coast or the West Coast, or you might have grew up in the Midwest, or you may have grown up in a different country other than America. And those things influenced you. Those things are norms for you within your culture. And so you have learned so much through that, right? And that has influenced how what you believe about yourself and what you believe about others you come in contact with. And what's fascinating about this idea of culture, and I love this subject because I think culture has a way of being instructive for all of us. I think culture has a way of teaching us how to move or how we understand ourselves and understand the people that we're engaging. And for me, this has been a big reality throughout the nature of my life, is that we are always engaging in context and culture. We're always engaging with culture. We're always coming face to face with that. And even among your friends and people that you know, you could come from the same culture, but you may have a different context. There are several cultures that you are experiencing all at once. Right now, as I'm talking to you, there is a culture within my family. My family has a culture. My school has a culture. My job has a culture. Everything I'm a part of has a culture, and it can be determined by the individuals that are a part of that culture. The second part of that is understanding my own personal context. For me, my own personal context is that I come from a two-parent household. My parents have been married for nearly 35 years, which is incredible. And they both are working class folks. They're deeply spiritual and religious folks who are the deep and profound faith. I went to public schools, and then I went to a private Christian university in the Midwest. All those things influences how I see myself and how I go about doing what I do. And the reality is, if you understand that about yourself, you understand that every person you come in contact with may have some similarities or they may have some differences, but they all come from a culture and a particular context. Have you ever considered that the way that you get better or the way that you are more effective in your engagement with people is stepping back and recognizing that they are influenced by something that they've experienced, that they are influenced by something that has shaped them, whether it is having a healthy and productive relationship with their parents or not a healthy and productive relationship with their parents. They may have been a child. There may be somebody watching or listening to this. As a child, you had to parent your parent. There may be someone watching or listening to this. As a child, you might have had a lot of love or engagement from your grandparents, and you spent more time with them than your actual parents. And that influences how you see parental relationships. I have friends who did not have healthy parental relationships, and now that they are parents, they are trying to redeem certain things about themselves through how they parent their children. They're trying to be to their kids what they did not experience. And sometimes those realities, a lot of times, those realities influence how we go about life and how we move in the world and why we do what we do. And I think oftentimes about how when I was in college, especially at Oral Roberts University, the school was so diverse culturally and ethnically that I often would live on the hallway with students who were coming from different parts of the world and how they might go about greeting one another or engaging one another or having conversations with one another. And those things often impacted our engagement. It also impacted the way that we talk, the way that we walk, the way that we operated, because they were operating through their culture and their context. And that should make us more understanding of people and give us the ability to be more empathetic and sympathetic to the folks that we engage with, because reality is they are moving within the context of their culture. And so I hope that today, as you're listening to this or thinking through these ideas, that you will recognize every situation you are engaging in is a matter of culture and context. Number two, these realities influences our decisions and responses to situations that arise. There was a study that was done by the National Library of Medicine in conjunction with some other institutions, and they actually did a study concerning the idea of stress or social stress. And some of the researchers compared white Americans to some individuals from Korea, Singapore, and Japan. And here's some of the findings that they were able to come up with as it relates to social stress. And I'm going to read this. And it says a goal of social stress in interdependent contexts is often to foster relationship closeness and group connectedness. The present study, therefore, explores the psychological consequences of social stress receipts motivated by self-esteem and by closeness in the move, closeness in more independent cultural context of the US and the more interdependent cultural context of the one of the countries that they talked about, which was Singapore. There are important cultural differences in the role of self-esteem in personal self-constructual, and these differences are implications for social stress receipts. And then that also goes on to say, found in the correlation, it found that a correlation between self-esteem and self-satisfaction is more often it said it found out that there's a correlation between self-esteem and self-satisfaction for folks that live in interdependent nations in comparison to more folks who are typically dealing with the self-esteem and self-satisfaction in more independent nations. It later goes on to say that those who are more independent contexts therefore tend to emphasize high self-esteem and strong sense of self. So it's pointing out the fact that if you come from a country or a context where it's driven by the individualism, it's driven by the person, it's driven by, hey, this idea that you as an individual matters the most, there is a likely chance you're going to operate in a space where you're trying to achieve high self-esteem and a strong sense of self. Let's be kind of clear about this particular subject, because here in America, one of the things that we deal with a lot of times is this idea of individualism. We fight quite hard to preserve our individuality. We do not like being compared to people. We do not like the idea of people saying that I'm like this person, or I'm like this person, or I'm just like them, or you're just like them. I mean, we even do it within our families, don't we? We don't like to be compared to certain individuals in our family. Why? Because we want to preserve our individualism. I was in a conversation in recent days where I was talking to a leader that is in my life and great dude. And one of the things that I was expressing to him is this feeling that I often struggle with. I often struggle with being misunderstood, because the feeling of being misunderstood means that my context or my culture is not being acknowledged. When I feel misunderstood, often I feel like I have to defend myself. When I feel misunderstood, what tends to happen is I become very, very driven to make you understand me, because there's a part of me that is trying to process or trying to always preserve this idea that I am not who you think I am. And obviously, as I've shared on here before, obviously that's a byproduct of childhood trauma. That's a byproduct of my life experiences. That's a byproduct of the culture that I come from. That's a byproduct of all these different factors. All these things are factors in why I operate in that regard. But the reality, at the end of the day, the reality is that I have to recognize that me as an individual is not being broken. It's me having to understand that there are people that may not understand me or may not see me in that context, because they are thinking about the situation as it relates to me individually. Like, this is something that happens quite often. Is my feeling of being misunderstood is a byproduct of me growing up in America and feeling like me as an individual is valuable, because I don't want to feel undervalued. I don't want to be judged by my group. I want to be judged as an individual. But that's cultural, right? That is something that I have learned by being an American, by growing up in this country. I am driven to try to do things that elevates me as an individual. Now, here's the interesting nuance. Because I'm an African American, I come from an environment that is very driven by this idea of collectivism, collective success. I remember a few years ago, I was watching a interview between this woman named Kristen Kane, who is a speaker and a minister. She was talking to this woman who's also a minister, who's a psychologist. Her name is Anita Phillips. And Dr. Anita Phillips said something that has stuck with me for years. And it was around the time that we were having a lot of discussions, particularly here in America, about social justice and criminal justice reform as it relates to police brutality and all those different kind of subjects that were coming up. We were having a lot of conversations in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And Dr. Phillips said something that has stuck with me for years. And she talked about how white Americans and Black Americans are thinking about these situations right now, but we have to go back into our history. We have to go back into the origins of the countries that we come from, or the continents in particular that we come from. And she talked about the Nords, and she talked about how people that come from the European peninsula, they came from nation states. They came from places in the world that were countries that were drawn together by a national identity. They had a national drive. They had individuals who were driven to actually be more about, hey, I am the king of this nation and I am the most powerful person in this particular area. And so if you engage me or come into contact with me, I'm going to ensure that you know who I am. And because of who I am, my nation is being impacted. But Dr. Phillips goes on to say, to some degree, and I encourage you to YouTube it and look it up. But Dr. Phillips will go on to talk about how most of the time African Americans, or people of African descent, and people who are generally of Latino descent, and people generally from Asian descent, we come from parts of the world that are very collective, that are very tribal in nature, that are very community based, and it's something in our DNA. It's so in us that anytime we engage on a particular subject, or anytime we deal with a particular thing, we are driven, or actually we operate from that place. Now, let's be very clear about something. I have not been to Africa yet. I've not been to certain parts of the world yet, but I do understand there is an inherent belief inside of me that everything that I do is not for me. Everything that I do is not about me. Everything that I do is for a group of people. It may not be African Americans at large, but I even think about the fact that when I've gotten my undergrad and master's degree, I remember I got the unique opportunity of being the speaker for the graduate class, my graduating class in college. I got to speak as a graduate student for the online program. And I remember saying quite clearly that this degree is not because of me. I'm getting these degrees because my grandfathers only had elementary educations. They were pulled out of school in elementary. My grandmothers only either dropped out at 10th grade or they just finished high school, right? Like they did not have the opportunity to do this. They did not have the opportunity to go get a degree. They did not have the opportunity to go and get all these different things. But I have them. And so therefore, because I have them, I'm so conscious of how I live out my life that it's not about me advancing in my own life. It's about me advancing the cause for them because they couldn't do it. They never got the opportunity to do it. They never got the chance to do it. So therefore, it is incumbent upon me to honor them in my education by getting what I get, because I'm not doing it for me. I'm doing it for them. That is a context in which I make decisions. Even right now, I'm debating whether or not should I maybe go back and get my doctorate at some point. Getting my doctorate is not about people calling me Dr. Lee A. Scott II, even though it has a ring to it. but at the end of the day, that's not even about me. It is about the fact that my grandfather, my granddaddy Isaac, and my granddaddy Roosevelt did not have the opportunity to even go to college. So therefore, why wouldn't I go and get the top thing? Why wouldn't I be the best of the best? Why wouldn't I try to achieve the pinnacle of success in a particular way? Why? Because it is not about them. Excuse me, not about me. It's about them. And people are living in that context. Here's my question for you. Are your decisions that you're making based on something you want to do, or is it based on people that have influenced you? Are you deciding? Are you making decisions? Are you coming to situations? Have you self-actualized enough? Are you self-actualized enough to be aware that the reason why you are responding the way you're responding is not because of you, it's because of them? And what I mean by them, it's all the people that have influenced your life positively and negatively, directly and indirectly. Are you the person that you are today because of all of the influences that have touched your life in some way, shape, form, or fashion? Hey, my life has changed, obviously, because I lived in a different place. My life has changed because I've experienced certain things. The color change that's happening in your life is a byproduct of your experiences. You are, there's a saying that we hear all the time: we are the sum total of our decisions. I agree with that statement, but let's also add to that, we are the sum total of people's decisions that they made about us. Because sometimes you don't actually make the decision about yourself. It's something that somebody else put on you. What have people put on you? What ideas or concepts or cultural things or rationales have people put on you that you are dealing with right now because of them? What lies have you believed? What things are true have you believed? What are all these things that have shaped who you are and brought you to this point? Because you have to debate or actually go back in your mind and think about, how did I get here? Right? Like, how did I get to this moment? How did I get to this era? Or how did I get to this particular conclusion? Because as you and your leadership, whether you believe you're a leader or not, you have to consider, how did you get to the places that you are in your life? Because nothing happens by accident. Those 7.5 years that I spent in Tulsa, Oklahoma has influenced me in a deep and profound way, especially at this point in my life. I spent all of my 20s, the vast majority of my 20s, not living in the place that I grew up in. I was even expressing to somebody literally a few days ago that I feel like I am in the third chapter of my life. It's a completely different landscape. It's a completely different book. It's a completely different story in a book, but at some point it'll all make sense. I don't know where, I don't know when, but at some point it'll all make sense in context of the story. Because I'm having an experience through my realities, through the fact that I moved 700 miles away from the place I grew up in a place that's much colder than here, and then moved back to the place, and the place is different, and I'm different. The situations are different, and I'm different. The people are different, and I'm different. The conversations might, some of the conversations might be the same, but I'm different because I have had a whole set of experiences. When people talk to me about certain issues now, I respond differently because of life realities and experiences. You have to ask yourself these type of questions. You have to think through. You have to take some time to actually consider, why am I responding the way I'm responding? Because there are two things happening. You are responding based on your culture, and you're responding based on your context. Now I'm going to take a break right here, and we'll be right back after this message.
Hi, everybody. Lee here, and I want to give some information to you. Do you need someone to host an event or come and speak at your event? You can now book yours truly. Book me for your event by visiting www.leeascott.com. I am so excited to connect with you and do work with you. Much love, and let's get started.
And we are back. Thank you so much for still being here as we've been talking about life, leadership, and legacy here on Leading with Lee. And I hope you've enjoyed and been inspired to really think about some stuff as it relates to this idea of understanding culture and context. And I want to keep talking about this because I think we cannot afford to keep moving through the world without recognizing how real these things are, how much we are impacted by the fact that we misunderstand one another often. We don't spend enough time considering the facts and realities that we face. And I'm going to move on to point number 3, because this is key and paramount to what we talk about here on Leading, is that these realities, your culture and your context, impacts how you lead people. Now, we just spent a few minutes talking about what happens when you are considering how you make decisions, and that you come from a culture and a context. And we just Gary did the time talking about those realities, right? We just really thought about that. But if you know anything about how I look at leadership, is I think leadership is twofold, is that you lead yourself and you also lead people. You influence yourself and you also influence people. Those two narratives, that intersection, often have the ability to shape your world around you. If you are not good at self-leadership, you're going to have some issues in the way you lead people. I was sharing with somebody literally in the last few days. I reflect a lot on conversations I have often. And oftentimes when I'm talking to you here on Leading, I'm talking about things that I'm experiencing in my life, in my own personal leadership, in my own personal development. And one of the things that I recognize or realize in a conversation that I was having with someone, I was expressing to a guy I consider a mentor and a leader in my life, that I felt like I had poor self-management. That was me analyzing where I felt I could have been more effective at. Now, you might be listening to watching this saying, oh, well, Lee, what are you talking about? You put out this content all the time. You're inspiring us. You're encouraging us. You're motivating us to do certain things. But I feel like in certain particular ways in my own life, there has been some poor management happening. And that poor management, if I don't deal with it, will affect how I do my work. I've shared on him many times before. I work for a nonprofit here in the city of Jackson. And my work, the reason why I can be successful is based on management. The only commodity that we have in this life is time. You can't get it back. Okay. All of us have time. That's what unifies the world at large. We don't know how much time we have. If you manage your time poorly, the results of that will be failure in certain ways that you don't want to fail. And I'm not talking about perfectionism. I'm not talking about living up to other people's standards. What I'm talking about is you actually recognizing, hey, I could be more efficient and more effective if I actually did these things a particular way. Here's something to encourage you. It may be the reason why you're not being as effective is you're probably not resting enough. The reason why you're not being as productive, you may not be engaging in conversations that you need to engage in. You may not be delegating enough information. You may be delegating too much. You may not be doing certain things that you need to do because you are operating in poor management. And the one thing about leadership is that we got to recognize, we have to always be so aware of what we're doing, that when it comes down to who we lead or who we influence or who we engage, we can clearly see the repercussions of those decisions. Give you a great example of something, and it happens from time to time, but I just hope it doesn't happen to you or happen with you because of poor management. There have been many stories we have read where leaders of companies, CEOs of companies that have grown and developed really fast and really quickly and have become such a juggernaut really fast or really speedily in certain situations, we find out that they're frauds. Prime example of that is things like the company WeWork. There was a whole documentary that was put on Hulu about this company WeWork that was a co-working company. They were doing all these different things where they had these huge buildings and they would have these conferences, and it was built around this individual, and I can't think of the guy's name right now. But come to find out, there was a lot of fraudulent activity happening within the organization. We're seeing this happen with Elizabeth Holmes right now. This young woman had a great idea with Thanos. She wanted to help people. But along the way, there were some character issues. There was some really, to get to brass tacks, there were poor management issues. Could have been personal. It could have been environmental. It could have been a lot of different factors. And I'm not on here, and let me be very clear, I'm not on here to attack these people. I'm just using them as examples. But there were poor self-management. There were poor management. There was poor communication between them and individuals that need to hold them accountable. And what ends up happening is these companies imploded. People are getting investigated. People are going to jail. People are losing their livelihoods because somebody did not realize that their personal issues, their personal processes, whatever they're doing in their lives, was going to impact other people. One thing I've realized all the time, I think about it so much now, it almost scares me sometimes how often I think about this, is that your decisions are not isolated. My decisions are not isolated. Every time I do something, it is impacting something that's going to happen 5, 10, 15 years from now. The work that I do right now is going to shape something that's going to happen 15 years from now. If I do it well, 15 years from now, when I'm doing something else, I will think back, or I will rely on the information or the relationships or the guidance I've gotten in this last year and a half. Why? Because I am the sum total of my experiences and my exposure. Decisions that I'm making, relationships that I'm developing, people that I'm coming in contact with, friendships that I'm developing, has a way of shaping how I lead people, how I impact people, how I engage people. Will it make me cynical? One of the problems that we have in a lot of environments, especially work environments, is you have leaders that are cynical. You have leaders that are pessimistic. That mentality has a way of seeping into the culture of an organization. It has a way of causing people to not engage in ways that they probably should, because that pessimistic, that cynical environment, that cynical mindset continues to perpetuate the idea that things are not possible. But the reason why people do that is because of two things: culture and context. The way a business's culture can become pessimistic is based on its leadership and how they operate as it relates to the context of things that's happening around them. Think about it. When we had the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 here in America, and we had all these companies that were giving these loans to folks, they were giving housing loans to people. They were giving financial loans, and people were dealing with stock buybacks and all these different things to folks. And it caused the financial bubble to get so large that literally when the bubble burst, it wiped out millions and billions of dollars with companies, with working class families. It impacted so much. That recession was crazy. People lost their homes. Hundreds of thousands of businesses closed down, probably even millions. Millions of families lost equity in their home because of decisions made by Fannie Mac and well, you know what I'm referring to. Fannie Mac and like literally these loaning companies that were giving housing loans to folks. They were giving them at crazy interest rates because they realized that they could make a whole bunch of money off of people. Those things, those decisions, the high interest rate that they were putting on things that they shouldn't be putting on stuff, they were doing this, that crippled millions of Americans, is something that there had to have been a permission structure to make that possible. There had to have been a culture in that particular agent or those particular agencies, those particular spaces for them to have predatory lending. As a result, we have to change federal regulations as it relates to how we sell homes, interest rates, how we deal with loans. We literally the federal government had to pass more laws as it relates to these types of actions. Because there was a response to a cultural problem that was literally costing Americans millions and costing Americans everything they had. And literally the past decade, most Americans have had to try to recover a bunch of stuff. And that was almost 15 years ago now, where we were dealing with this in 2007, 2008, and folks are now continuously dealing with those realities. Even post-COVID, we don't know what all we'll see based on studies 5 or 10 years from now. We don't know the social impact yet. I don't even think we have really rationalized how much COVID has had an impact on the way we think about ourselves culturally and in the context of where we live. I know it has had a deep and profound impact on me. The way I see myself is very different from the way I saw myself in 2019. The way I move and operate and engage with people is very different from the way I operated in 2019. Obviously, that would have changed over time because I just got older. But it is also being filtered to the fact that I lived through a once in a generation pandemic. Now, we had pandemics before to an extent, to a certain degree, but not to that scale. Where there are over 1 million Americans that died. And globally, there was hundreds of millions of people, even billions of people who had contracted COVID. And there are parts of the world that are still dealing with COVID right now. Still having issues with getting access to vaccines and trying to contain the virus. There's reports right now of some things that's going on in China right now, where there's a possibility that it might be an undercount of how many cases they might have had. Because we're dealing with the realities that leaders, because of their culture and context, affect how people are doing and affect people's lives. Point number 4, and I am getting you out of here. Okay. The last point: grow in your capacity for learning. Grow in your capacity for learning. We've talked about the reality that you come from a culture and a context. We talked about the reality that your culture and context influences your decisions and your responses in situations. And we have also talked about how you and your leadership, how those realities impact how you lead people. But a solution to that problem is that you got to learn and grow. Got to learn to move a little bit differently, because whether you recognize it or not, all of us have an opportunity to grow. I was in a meeting with my boss, Samuel Bolin, a few days ago, and it was fascinating to me because as I was sitting there listening to these individuals, there were people in this meeting that were business owners and developers and pastors and elected officials and professors, and they just come from different contexts. And we're talking about a range of issues as it relates to some things that are happening here in Jackson, Mississippi. And I remember reflecting on that conversation. I even had a conversation with my boss, Samuel, afterwards about it, because I was thinking about all the things that was flooding my mind. And one thing I really gathered from that is these three things that I want to give to you, because I really don't want to necessarily make a point about this, but I just want to give you some instructive things that I think is super important for all of us to do as it relates to growing our capacity, as it relates for learning. Is number one, we have to engage people outside of our common circle. If you watched or listened to the last episode of Leading, I kind of talk a lot about, I've been doing a lot of this, particularly in this season, is talking about this idea of cross-pollination. Like, we got to learn how to engage people that don't particularly come from the same mindset, same experience, the same exposure as us. You might learn something. Hey, let me encourage you real quick. You might actually learn something from your enemies. You might actually learn something from people that you don't like. You might actually learn something from people that don't like you. Not that you take what they're saying as fact, but maybe it is a situation, as there's an old colloquialism that goes like, eat the meat and spit out the bones. They may have some insight that can really move you forward or propel you forward in a way that is helpful. We need cross-industry conversations. We need cross-cultural conversations. We need cross-contextual conversations. Like, we need that. We need that engagement, because that engagement has the ability to put you in a place where you are more effective and more understanding of realities around you. Trust me, my life, I'm telling you, my life has been that a lot of times. I've always been in cross-cultural, cross-contextual conversations, whether when I was in school, was in the fact that my dad worked in a suburban area here in the Jackson metro area, whether it was APAC, or whether it was the university that I went to, or whether the jobs that I've had, all these different things have always been a cross-cultural or cross-contextual situation that has influenced how I move and operate in the world. It's always been instructive. Now, it's never caused me to draw back, and it actually made me understand how necessary it is for me to know who I am and not back off of that, but be more observant as it relates to that subject. Because some of the greatest lessons you can learn may just be through one conversation. I promise you, that conversation I was in with my boss, I learned something. I was inspired in some way. I was influenced in some way. I was encouraged in some way. Oh, these people are on the same wavelength. These people are considering these different things. These people are recognizing some of these things. And we have to be mindful of these realities. We got to be mindful of these realities. Is that we have to know how to engage folks. Number two, as it relates to this, how do we grow in our capacity for learning? Number two, the second part of that is listen a lot. Sometimes, and I struggle with this, and I will quite frankly admit to this. because it goes back to something I struggle with, and I'm sharing it with you on here. I don't want to be misunderstood. So sometimes I don't listen because I also want people to recognize that maybe what they're telling me is something I've already thought about. But that's not my job in those conversations. Some of the best leaders have the aptitude and ability to listen very well. Some of you are in relationships. Some of you have long-term friendships. If you learn anything how to maintain that relationship or that friendship, it is a matter of you listening. The reason why you've been there so long is because you've been good at listening. Most breakups, most breakdown in friendships, most breakdown in work relationships happen not because people have ill, will or something like that. Now, sometimes they do, but most of the time it's miscommunication. Most of the time, people are failing to have productive conversations. People are failing to communicate well. So what's end up happening is there's a miscommunication that happens, and so people start taking sides. People start to fall in a particular way. There's a misunderstanding. We're dealing with partial information. People are moving quickly. People are saying particular things. People are not asking enough questions. People are not actually listening. And so what ends up happening is a miscommunication happens, and then there's a breakdown in that relationship. There's a breakdown in that partnership. There's a breakdown in that friendship. There's a breakdown. And now you have to go back and figure out, where do we get off? Where do we get off? Where do we fall short? How did that happen? Because it should have been this bad, but somebody didn't communicate well, or somebody actually was not listening. The way we get better at growing our capacity for learning is listening a lot. I spend a great deal of time. If I'm not listening to someone directly, I'm listening to people indirectly. I listen to so much information. I listen to podcasts weekly. I listen to interviews weekly. I listen to information weekly. I'm reading something weekly. I'm engaging information all the time. Why? Because I recognize when I learn and are willing to grow, I am going to increase in my capacity. You're hindering yourself because you are unwilling to shut up. Sorry, I hate to say it like that. You're unwilling to close your mouth. Stop trying to be a know-it-all. I'm talking to myself, really. Stop trying to be the most intelligent person in the room. You do not have to prove anything to anyone if you're in the room. The reason why they invited you into that space is because you have the capacity to impact them. You are already worthy. And also understand, when it's your time to speak, use it wisely. Use it wisely. And here's my last point as it relates to growing and your capacity for learning. My hope is that you increase in patience and be willing to make mistakes. Here's the reality in your leadership. You will not get everything right. And if you think you're going to get everything right, there's a problem. No leader is perfect. No leader will say all the right things. No leader will do all the right things. No leader will actually operate completely 100% right. Because you know what? We all are human. We all have human capacity. We just do. So you're going to make mistakes, but you have to have the humility. You have to have the willingness to say, you know what? I didn't get that right. I didn't understand what you meant by this. I didn't understand how you came to this situation. I didn't understand how you came to that conclusion. So let me step back and listen. Let me step back and ask questions. Let me step back and consider maybe I might have been wrong about this. Maybe I might have been right about this. Maybe I might have talked about this issue in a particular way that was unproductive. You have to know that. Because here's the thing. In order for you to be more effective as a leader, you got to have a level of humility. Leadership is not just about leading people and influencing them. Leadership is also about understanding your role in what you do and how you do it. Because sometimes the best leaders don't say much. Sometimes the best leaders don't say anything at all, quite frankly. It's how they move. Please don't be a person that says, do what I say and not what I do. Because that's an excuse. Own up to the things you don't do right. Own up to the things that you do well. Own up to the fact that you may or may not hit the mark. But because you are willing to understand culture and context, and you realize everybody that you're dealing with is coming to a space like that, learn to be more empathetic. Because you're doing that, you can be more successful in every aspect of your life, because every single person has a capacity and level of leadership, as I say all the time. We got to recognize that you have a responsibility to understand people. You have the responsibility to come into any space recognizing that I am here to grow in my capacity to learn. So I hope you were inspired this week. I hope you'll take these things that I'm saying to you today and actually apply them to your life, because I truly believe that you are going to change the world. I see you next time here on Leading with Lee, and much love, because we about to go get started on something. Thank you for watching and or listening to this week's episode of Leading with Lee. If you have not done it yet, subscribe on YouTube and all podcasting platforms. If you want to get more information and connect with me, visit me at www.leeascott.com or follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Lee A. Scott II or Lee A. Scott II. So thank you for watching, much love, and let's get started.